Hello, cooking enthusiasts. This week's video has been a long time in the making. If you've been following me on Instagram, you'll know I've been talking about my chocolate gelato recipe for months. All the way back in the summer of 2019, this was originally a little recipe for utilizing the homemade 100% dark chocolate I had processed with my chocolate conch. Obviously, 99.9% of people aren't going to make their own chocolate, but I was originally just going to theoretically suggest substitutions for store-bought chocolate. After some further iterations, I maybe became slightly obsessed with making the perfect chocolate gelato in general. So as you can see, I have since started using a store-bought dark chocolate. As you can see, this is footage of one of my caregivers helping me make the most recent iteration of the gelato recipe, which is version 4.0. You will need some type of blender, again, preferably a high-powered blender like a Vitamix. Otherwise, the only equipment you need is a very basic ice cream machine, the type that I have with a frozen bowl is very affordable. However, for this recipe, you will need at least a few specialty ingredients. In the blender right now, for example, is the dark chocolate, some brown sugar, a little molasses, and dextrose. Dextrose is one of those ingredients you really can't skimp on, but really, it's not that difficult to find and is one of the very functional ingredients for this recipe. In terms of the chocolate, of course, feel free to use homemade refined cocoa paste. Otherwise, you'll want to use at least an 85% dark chocolate, and you want to use an eating chocolate, not a couverture chocolate. A high quality chocolate intended for melting and shaping is going to be good, but it usually has a pretty decent amount of added cocoa butter, and that's not a bad thing, but it does actually limit the quantity of chocolate we can put into the gelato. So simply get an 85% or higher chocolate bar, or likely several, and figure out which one you like the taste of the best. So you will notice in the written recipe, the quantity of dark chocolate is a variable. You need to figure out the percentage of fat in your specific chocolate bar and then divide that into 70. So the brand I was using was basically 50% fat, so I needed 140 grams in my ice cream. Something I wasn't able to film was reserving some of the measured dextrose and combining it with the salt and stabilizers, in this case, xanthan gum and locust bean gum. I blended up the chocolate and other forms of sugar just to give them a little more surface area, and then separately warmed up the milk in a double boiler. Once it gets warm, you want to sprinkle in your mixture of salt and stabilizers. You want to bring the milk mixture to 85 Celsius while stirring very frequently. Once your milk mixture reaches temperature, you're going to bring it to the blender and thoroughly blend it with the other ingredients. If possible, with your blender, you want to start on a slow speed and slowly ramp up. If you're like me, you'll blow a fuse. You'll probably need to scrape down the sides with a spatula and blend a second time. Again, if possible, with your blender, put it into turbo mode to make sure the chocolate is thoroughly melted and emulsified. You now pretty much have dark chocolate gelato base, but it needs to get covered in plastic wrap and rest in the fridge overnight. But obviously leave it at room temperature for a few hours first. The overnight rest is really important to hydrate the stabilizers, but afterward the mixture is going to be extremely thick, so you'll need to blend it again before churning. This is also a good opportunity to add an optional ingredient that I added, which is a little bit of alcohol. You'll want to use 30 grams or mils of something that is at least 40% alcohol by volume or 80 proof. I was just using some vodka that I had infused with vanilla and nutmeg, but you could also use something like rum, whiskey, brandy, etc. It is definitely optional, but it is also functional because it just really guarantees that the gelato is soft and scoopable directly out of the freezer. Cocoa butter and cocoa solids tend to make ice cream particularly hard, so the alcohol really softens it up. Either way, once the mixture is blended again, it warms up a little bit, so you'll want to let it rest in the freezer just while you set up your machine and whatnot. I was also setting up an additional optional flourish, which was some straight up melted chocolate to drizzle directly into the gelato. Stracciatella is a very classic gelato flavor that is generally plain or vanilla gelato with streaks of actual chocolate inside, but I wanted to just double down on the dark chocolate. It's something you'll need to look out for because we've worked really hard to make this gelato soft and scoopable. It won't appear as thick even once it's churned. I know for my machine, once the mixture inside hits around -10 degrees Celsius, it's not going to get much colder. So that is the point where I drizzle in some of my melted chocolate. If you are going for this optional extra, I do really recommend using a piping bag or a Ziploc with a very small hole cut into the corner. It's important to get nice, fine threads of solid chocolate into the mixture, but then it's just about getting it into a container and adding some additional decoration. Again, it will probably look much softer than other homemade ice cream, but trust me, it will work. Of course, it needs to sit in the freezer overnight, or better yet, a full 24 hours, and the results should be pretty much perfect. With the addition of the alcohol, it's definitely scoopable directly out of the freezer, and even without, it should be pretty close. The texture is dense but very smooth and luscious. It's definitely for people who like dark chocolate because it's very intense, but I intentionally made it very intense because it actually holds up to other sweet things like cookies and fruit, and could also balance out other flavors of gelato. And with a recipe that is already intense, it's always a little easier to experiment and dial back, as opposed to making it more intense. But if you enjoy making ice cream and like dark chocolate, I highly recommend giving this recipe a try. I know it's a little bit complicated, so if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. Otherwise, thank you for watching.